I think God of War 2 is a strong contender for the title of most improved sequel of all time. Sometimes while playing the first game, it definitely felt like a 20-year-old game. In contrast, God of War 2's gameplay is so smooth and so competent that I honestly think this game feels like it could have been released last week. Every single flaw of the first game has either been reduced or eliminated entirely. The whole game feels so much more confident and so much more polished. Even now, nearly 2 decades later, even after the release of the Norse titles, I still think God of War 2 might be the best game in the series. And in this video, I am going to explain why. Let us begin with the platforming. In my retrospective of the first game, I talked a lot about how the combat in that game has largely aged very well. It is still fast-paced and fluid and cinematic and brutal and bloody and all kinds of other positive adjectives. However, the platforming in that game is the exact opposite. It is often slow and clunky and frustrating and severely punishing. The platforming was something where I just had to kind of grit my teeth and endure it until I could get back to the better parts of the game. On the other hand, the platforming in God of War 2 has been elevated to the same level of quality as the combat. Now it is fast, it is fluid, it is bombastic and crazy and explosive. This game has the best platforming sequences in the entire series, hands down, no arguments. Whereas in the previous game I was filled with a sense of dread and anxiety every time I reached a new platforming section because I knew I was going to be in for a lot of pain and frustration. Now I actually look forward to the platforming in 2. It is just as much fun as the combat, if not even more so. Allow me to show you 2 examples. In the prologue, after an extended battle with the Colossus of Rhodes that carries you across the entire burning besieged city, Kratos smashes a hole in its exterior and throws himself inside. The interior of the Colossus is this intricate vertical web of wooden scaffolding and magical electrified machinery, and as a result of its devastating battle with Kratos, the whole thing is burning down and falling apart all around you as you advance through the shattered core. You have to jump across platforms and climb across ropes as a wave of fire slowly advances from beneath you, and as the platforms are actively collapsing under your feet. It is cinematic and cool, and there is no clunkiness or frustration here at all. Kratos moves smoothly and easily from section to section. When you compare it to that horrific, endless, brutal Hades level from the first game, which was so clunky and so annoying, it is just a night and day difference in quality. Or for another example, much later in the game, you reach a location called the Great Chasm. This is, as the name suggests, a vast chasm separating the fortress of the Sisters of Fate from the rest of their island. Once upon a time in the distant past, a grand bridge once spanned this chasm. Unfortunately, the ages have not been kind to that bridge, and years of decay have reduced it to little more than a collection of shaky stone ruins and columns jutting out from the abyss of the chasm. In God of War 2, Kratos has a new ability. He can use his chain swords as grappling hooks to throw his body through the air. This allows for platforming that is much flashier and faster and more acrobatic, and that is what we do here in the chasm. He throws himself from ruined column to ruined column as his weight causes the remnants of the ancient bridge to collapse, and it begins to fall apart all around him. It is a section of gameplay that is just as cinematic as God of War's best boss fights. And most important of all, it is fun, which is a word I never would have used to describe the platforming of the previous game. Next, let's talk about the puzzles, another area in the previous game I criticized in my last video, because they have been improved in the sequel as well. The antagonist of God of War 2 are the Sisters of Fate, beings with the power to control time. and so time control mechanics feature prominently in a lot of the gameplay. Usually it is something simple like slowing down time so you can cross a platform before it collapses, or make it through a doorway before the gate slams shut, stuff like that. Occasionally though, the developers use the time mechanics in more interesting ways. This one here is probably my favorite puzzle in the game. What is happening here is that Kratos needs this temple priest to help him complete a sacrificial ritual in order to progress his quest. But that priest really does not want to help. So much so that he will actually throw himself off the side of this balcony to his death as soon as he sees Kratos. So what the player has to do is jump through this time portal over and over again, restarting the loop again and again, until you can just barely reach the priest in time and stop him from throwing himself off the balcony. But don't worry, in case you thought this rescue was evidence of Kratos going soft, we are going to kill him ourselves a few minutes after saving him. The Kratos of God of War 2 is an even more brutal and violent character than he was in the first game, but I will discuss the story in more detail later. In the heavy use of time mechanics in the puzzles, I think you can definitely see the developers taking a lot of inspiration from the Prince of Persia series. In my retrospective of the first game, I spent a lot of time talking about other big action-adventure franchises available at the time of release, mostly to demonstrate just how similar the first God of War was to those other titles. That, in spite of all the innovation in its combat system, it was actually a very typical or even generic action-adventure game for its time. And another big, huge, popular action-adventure series of that generation was the Prince of Persia Sands of Time trilogy. While I left this out of my discussion in the last video, I actually think the first two God of War games are more similar to the Sands of Time trilogy than they are to any other game series. The kinds of puzzles you encounter, the level design, the structure of the world design, the combat, even the music is really similar. They both have this kind of dusty, sandy, ancient, mysterious, vaguely exotic Near East flavor to them. The third Sands of Time game, The Two Thrones, which is, by the way, one of my personal all-time favorite games ever, even released in 2005, the same year as God of War. So I don't know why I left it out of my discussion in the last video, temporary insanity, I guess. And while we are on the topic of contemporary action-adventure series that I should have discussed in the last video, a lot of comments on that video mentioned the Devil May Cry series, which was a very obvious inspiration for the first God of War game, one that even the developers cited in interviews along with the Prince of Persia and Ico. And by the way, I'm gonna keep pronouncing that as Ico because that's how I've said it since I was a kid. If you are one of the dozen people who wrote very angry comments about that pronunciation on the last video, then I encourage you to take a deep breath, eat a whole entire pizza, and then vomit it back up, because you don't need all those extra calories. Back to Devil May Cry. In particular, the combat of the first God of War feels very similar to the combat of Devil May Cry. The fixed camera angles, the focus on spectacle and flow and acrobatics, the long combos, even the enemies dropping red orbs to be collected when they are killed. I think God of War's combat is still definitely far faster and flashier and more fluid than Devil May Cry, but commenters were right that any discussion of the action-adventure landscape that inspired the development of the God of War series really needs to include at least a mention of DMC. But I'm getting lost in a very long tangent here. The whole point of this comparison was that the time manipulation puzzles of God of War 2 were inspired by the time manipulation puzzles of the Sands of Time trilogy, which was another popular action-adventure series at the time. Now, let's move on to some discussion of the boss fights, and oh my goodness, the boss fights. In the last video, I discussed how the first game only has 3 true boss fights, and they all feel at least a little clunky or frustrating to fight in some way. In the sequel, there are 3 times as many major bosses, as well as a ton more minor boss fights, very few of which feel clunky at all. There is so much variety and creativity on display in the boss encounters here. They all feel completely different from each other. They are each based around some unique design choice. And it is not just the spectacle that makes them so good. In fact, a lot of these fights do not involve all that much spectacle. The boss fights of God of War 2 tend to be pretty small in scale. At times, the whole game can feel like a kind of royal rumble between Kratos and a bunch of classic heroes of Greek mythology. The roster is made up of characters like Theseus, the founder of Athens, or Perseus, the great-grandfather of Hercules, or Icarus from the famous fable of flying too close to the sun, and even the barbarian king from the previous game makes another appearance, now risen from the dead. These fights are not filled with extravagance and bombast. Instead, they feel very intimate, like close-quarters one-on-one duels between warriors of nearly equal skill and power. A lot of the boss fights in the other Greek games, especially in 3, have more of a David and Goliath quality to them. Like Kratos is just this tiny little guy facing off against a far bigger and more powerful opponent. And don't get me wrong, those fights can definitely be really cool, I love those too. But I think all of the best fights in the series are like these. Smaller in scale, more vicious, more desperate, and more intimate. Like Baldur in God of War 4, or Heimdall in Ragnarok, or Pollux and Castor in Ascension, or Erinys in Ghost of Sparta. 2 has more of this category of boss fight than any other game in the series, and for that reason alone, I think it may have the best fights in the whole franchise. But when it wants to do spectacle, oh boy, God of War 2 can do spectacle. The Colossus of Rhodes makes for an awesome opening. The battle against the Sisters of Fate at the end gets completely crazy. However, none of that is what makes God of War 2 a truly great game. This is something I talked about in my previous retrospective. A lot of times when people discuss the old God of War games, they do exactly what I just did. They focus way too much on the action and the violence and the boss fights, because those do tend to be show stealers. But these are not action games, they are action-adventure games. They actually have some of the best adventure gameplay of their entire generation, and that's what made me, and a lot of other people, fall in love with the series in the first place. I was reading through some old interviews with the developers, and I came across this quotation from David Jaffe, the creative director of the first 2 games. He was discussing the inspirations for the game, and he mentioned the film Raiders of the Lost Ark. And he said, quote, "Raiders was the movie I saw as a kid that made me want to do creative stuff with my life. I wanted to make a game that made players feel like I felt when I was 10 watching Raiders. I didn't want to make a game that put you in the shoes of Indiana Jones. I wanted to put you in the shoes of the 10-year-old kid watching Indiana Jones." And this makes total sense to me when you look at the first game. It has this classic adventure quality to it, exploring ancient tombs, traversing deadly traps, solving puzzles. But it was also very intentionally cinematic and spectacular. You don't get a close, intimate, over-the-shoulders camera angle like in the Legend of Zelda series, but instead you play from a distant, static, fixed camera angle, the way you might while watching a movie. Most of the first game took place inside of Pandora's Temple, which was this mountain-sized, vast, sprawling dungeon, strapped to the back of a wandering titan, filled with deadly traps and puzzles. It was super duper cool. I think one of the coolest settings in any fantasy adventure game ever. God of War 2 does have its own version of Pandora's Temple. The majority of this game takes place inside a location called the Island of Creation. This is the ancient, and I mean not just ancient, but prehistoric, the primordial birthplace of Gaia, Mother Earth herself, the progenitor of the Titans and the goddess of all life. And in the present, it is the home of the Sisters of Fate, who are more than mere gods. They are beings with the power to control time itself. They can determine the fates of every god, titan, and mortal in the world, including both Zeus and Kratos. Or at least they think they can control Kratos' fate. Like every other supposedly invulnerable divine entity in this series, they are going to learn the hard way what happens when you stand in the way of this particular chronically depressed and homicidal Spartan warrior. The goal of God of War 2 is to reach the Sisters of Fate, so that Kratos can seize the power to change his own fate. so that he can travel back in time and defeat Zeus. And there are a lot of weird time travel shenanigans going on in this game. It actually creates some pretty goofy plot holes in the story, but we'll dig into that more later. In order to reach the Sisters of Fate, Kratos plunges into the mysterious depths of the Island of Creation, explores its primordial forests and ancient temples, uncovers its lost secrets, battles twisted monsters and fellow champions. The Island of Creation is a very different kind of setting than Pandora's Temple. Pandora's Temple was a dead and forgotten place. It was dusty and dry and crumbling. It was a dungeon or labyrinth that had been constructed by mortals with a specific purpose, and you could find evidence of that construction all over the place. Cranes and scaffolding and catwalks, whereas the Island of Creation is, obviously, an island. It was not constructed, it was grown. It is absolutely filled to the brim with life and nature. Instead of mazes and catwalks, you are exploring bogs and swamps and forests and canyons and ancient ruins. The island feels really dense with history, like so many important events have occurred here, and so many gods and titans and heroes have stepped foot here. Kratos' current visit is just one more chapter in the island's long legend. I have a hard time deciding whether I prefer Pandora's Temple or the Island of Creation. On the one hand, God of War 2 is an objectively better game, with far less frustrating or clunky puzzles and platforming. But the Island of Creation does lack some of the focus that Pandora's Temple had. It has this kind of meandering quality. It can feel like Kratos is just sort of randomly wandering around the forests and swamps and only getting closer to his goal by accident. The adventure gameplay itself is still excellent though. I love the sense of exploration and mystery and magic in this setting. The most interesting part of the Island of Creation is that Kratos is not the only legendary champion present here at the start of the game. He is not the only hero trying to reach the Sisters of Fate so that he can change his destiny. The island is filled with all these other characters who have their own stories, their own motivations, their own legends, who are trying to do the same thing and who Kratos keeps crossing paths with, which leads to all those great boss battles I mentioned earlier. My only complaint with these other characters is that, once again, their encounters feel really random, like Kratos just kind of bumps into them completely by accident. There is almost never any proper build-up to the confrontation. Most of the time you'll just walk into a random room and then, oh, there's Perseus, or whoever, okay, let's fight him, here we go. Icarus is maybe the worst offender of all of them. Kratos is walking out onto this bridge, and then Icarus, out of nowhere, without any introduction or build-up at all, just shows up. He climbs up onto the bridge and starts heckling Kratos because he has wings and Kratos doesn't. It is so random and bizarre. I really wish there were more interactions with these other characters, or that they played a greater role in the larger narrative. They usually die only minutes after their introduction. God of War 3 does a way better job of setting up its boss battle encounters and making them feel important to the larger plot of the game. And so do most of the other games in the series too. And while, as I already mentioned, the puzzles and platforming of God of War 2 are usually less frustrating than those in the previous game, there are still a couple challenges here that are a huge pain in the ass and that drag the whole experience down with them. My least favorite puzzle in the game is this one. So what you have to do here is push this block from one end of the room to the other, while giant waves of fire are spewing out of the wall on the far end, which can both damage Kratos and force the block backwards, reversing your progress. Luckily, if you stand behind the block, you are safe from the fire. Not so luckily, the puzzle also features endlessly respawning enemies, who have a stupid amount of health and a bunch of area of effect attacks. You constantly have to stop pushing the block to deal with these enemies. and while dodging their attacks, you are basically guaranteed to accidentally fall outside the block's protection, where you will get hit by constant waves of fire spewing out of the wall. This section is so freaking annoying, I hate it. It might be my least favorite puzzle in any God of War game. If there is one thing I could cut from the game, it would be this. Another annoying challenge, frequently cited by fans, is this one. So here you have to lower the elevator Kratos is standing on before the ceiling descends on top of his head, because that ceiling is covered in death spikes. As you try to lower the elevator though, these annoying skeletons keep spawning in. And they don't just attack Kratos, but also grab onto the elevators and hold the elevator in place. No matter how good you are at the game's combat, no matter how fast you kill these skeletons, even if you are perfect, you will only ever barely have enough time to get the elevator lowered before you are crushed. It can be very frustrating. But these are definitely the exceptions rather than the rule. I find the vast majority of the puzzles and platforming in this game to actually be really fun. So 2 is a huge improvement over the first in every single category, with one exception. There is one thing that I think the first game does better, and that is the story. 2 suffers from that classic problem of being stuck in the middle of a 3-part narrative, but I will discuss that in more detail later in the video. First, I want to pull back some, and instead of talking about the game itself, I want to talk about the larger context of when and where God of War 2 released. Because when it was released and the system it was released on is actually kind of fascinating. Okay, so God of War 2 was released for the PlayStation 2 on March 13th, 2007. The PlayStation 3, the console, was released in North America on November 17th, 2006 of the previous year, a full 4 months earlier. This was really unusual for the time. Of course, nowadays it is not unusual at all. Nearly the PlayStation 5's entire first-party library was cross-platform with the PS4 for the first couple years after its release. Though God of War 2 is technically not a cross-platform game, there was no PS3 version. But back in 2007, this was almost unheard of. Sony, Nintendo, and Microsoft just did not release big new first-party games on their old platforms, or at least only very rarely. The only other example I can think of is when Donkey Kong Country 3 released on the Super Nintendo a couple months after the N64 was already out back in 1996, but I'm sure there must be other examples. The only public reason the developers ever gave for this decision was that the PS2 had a larger audience than the PS3 at the time, and they wanted to reach more players. But of course that was true for every first-party PlayStation 3 exclusive for the first couple years. So yeah, I don't know if that explanation really holds water. I suspect there must have been some other reason behind the scenes, but we'll never know. If anything, this decision is mostly just evidence of what a chaotic mess the initial release of the PlayStation 3 was. The PS3 had a really rough first couple years. It was released a whole year after the Xbox 360, so it was playing catch-up right out of the gate. It was a very expensive console at $600. I mean, that is a lot of money today, and we're talking nearly 20 years ago. It was a tough sell, especially because its launch lineup was pretty weak. It had weird, complicated internal architecture that developers initially had a lot of trouble developing for, which completely ruled out any possibility of an easy port job. The PS3 really needed a game like God of War 2, a major landmark release, a first-party exclusive, to push system sales at that exact moment. But instead, it was released exclusively on the PS2. Not that I was complaining at the time. I definitely did not have the money to buy a PS3, so I was just psyched that I got to play it at all. In any case, this led to an interesting perception of the game among both players and critics, Because it was, arguably, the last major video game release for the PlayStation 2, it became seen as a swan song or last hurrah for the console and, by extension, an entire generation of video games. The thing is, the PS2 had a crazy library, one of the best libraries that any video game console has ever had, and God of War 2 coming in at the very end felt like a kind of crowning jewel. It pushed the technical limits of the PS2 as far as they could go. It is one of, if not the, best looking game on the console. I think it actually looks better than a lot of early PS3 and 360 games. And not only that, it plays better too. It is so polished and so smooth. There is practically no glitchiness or jankiness or clunkiness to be found here. It was a truly next-gen experience on an old-gen console. But let's move on. What I want to do now is run through the game from start to finish, with a focus on story and character, on how Kratos is being developed here, because I think he is portrayed to be a very different kind of character in this second game. Something I discussed in my previous video is that Kratos was more of a failed hero in that first game than an actual anti-hero. He was a character who was, at least sometimes, trying to do the right thing. In the first level of that game, he tries to save these women locked in the captain's quarters of the ship from the monsters, but he arrives too late. He seemed to me like someone who had a desire to be better, to maybe even be a hero, but who kept failing. That aspect of his character is gone in the sequel. In God of War 2, Kratos has very solidly progressed into a full-on anti-hero. He never ever tries to do the right thing. He never tries to save anyone, not really. At the start of the game, he is a character who has lost absolutely everything, or almost everything. He still has one thing in his life that he's clinging to. One thing that still gives his life meaning, that gives him a reason to keep on living. And the moment he loses that last connection to his humanity is when he truly hits rock bottom, when he becomes the cruel and brutal vengeance-obsessed monster that we will play as in God of War 3. Okay, so let's get started. God of War 2 opens with a shot of Kratos, now the official God of War of the Greek pantheon, sitting upon his throne on Mount Olympus, flanked by two hot babes. Though these two do have their shirts on, which is very surprising for this series. Though it's good to see that Kratos is still just as much of a miserable hedonist now as he was in the last game. The narrator tells us that, after ascending to godhood, Kratos found himself alone, shunned by his fellow gods. But he did not care because he had found a new family in the warriors of Sparta, finding solace from his past in the carnage of battle. And we are shown an image of Spartan soldiers slaughtering the defenders of Rhodes. In this narration, we are explicitly told that Kratos is motivated by loneliness and a need to distract himself from the sins of his past. Because his family is now long dead, and because the Olympians refuse to accept him, the only people in all the world he has any connection to at all are the warriors of Sparta. So he throws himself totally into that relationship as a kind of surrogate family, to replace the one he himself murdered. And he interacts with the Spartans in the only way he knows how. He leads them in battle, he leads them on an endless conquest across the Greek world, destroying city after city, all for the supposed glory of Sparta. You have to remember, at this point in his story, Kratos is not a very emotionally developed man. He tends to interact with the rest of the world in very simplistic and crude ways. He does not know any life other than being a soldier. He does not know how to be anything else, and he does not try to learn either. He is very stuck in his ways. I have also wondered if he is meant to have some sort of death wish here, if he is picking a fight with Olympus on purpose, either as an outlet for his rage, or because he wants the chance to be killed in battle with the other gods. There is a suggestion in the narration that if the Olympians had been more accepting of him, tried to form some kind of relationship with him, tried to show him another way forward, things might have been different. But the Olympians are nothing if not arrogant and stubborn and cruel. Considering that, Kratos fits right in. As the scene continues, Athena intercepts Kratos and begs him to cease his campaign of conquest. She says that with each city that falls, the wrath of Olympus grows. She says that she will not be able to protect him anymore. As he rebuffs her, she becomes angry and orders him to not turn his back on her. And when he continues to ignore her, she declares ominously that he has left her no choice. Someday, when these retrospective videos are finished, I will do a full video on Athena. She is a very enigmatic character. On the one hand, she is definitely afflicted by the same arrogance as the other Olympians, and everything that happens in this series is as much her fault as it is Ares. But she is also one of the few gods in the whole franchise who seems to have genuinely well-intended motivations, so she is hard to pin down. But that is a topic for another video. Moving forward, as Kratos walks away, the narrator says, Kratos had turned the pain of his memories into hatred. Hatred for the gods who had refused to free him from the nightmares of his past deeds. And so he went to Rhodes to deliver the final blow to the besieged city. In my last video, I talked about how, despite his reputation as a character fueled by rage, in the first game in the series, Kratos was really more motivated by sadness and regret than by anger. As revealed by this bit of narration though, that is no longer the case in the second game. In God of War 2, Kratos is a character motivated more than anything else by hatred. And next we see a super duper huge Kratos unleashing that hatred upon the innocent citizens of the city of Rhodes. At this moment he has very literally become Ares. If you will remember, Ares did the exact same thing to the city of Athens in the previous game, sending his minions to slaughter the citizens while he trampled over the burning ruins, smashing whole buildings underneath his feet. At the start of God of War 2, Kratos has transformed into the same insane, violent monster he spent the entire first game trying to stop. And something I did not discuss in detail in the last game is that back then, all of the gods of Olympus united behind Kratos in his effort to defeat Ares, granting him magical boons and power. And now they are going to unite against Kratos in the exact same way. He has already set himself on a path that will inevitably lead to a confrontation with Mount Olympus. And it is not as if he has some justification for destroying the city of Rhodes. Ares did have a reason for invading Athens, a selfish and evil reason, but still. He was in the middle of an active conflict with his sister Athena that had been going on for years. Kratos, on the other hand, is just being a jerk. He is killing thousands of people just to soothe his own emotional wounds. Soon after his arrival in Rhodes, Kratos is attacked by this white bird, which Kratos believes was sent by Athena. The bird first shocks him with electricity that causes him to shrink down to normal size, and then uses the same electricity to bring the famous Colossus of Rhodes to life to defend its city. I was honestly really disappointed by this development as a kid, by Kratos getting shrunk down to normal size in the first 5 minutes. When I first played the game, I really thought we were going to actually get to play as giant Kratos attacking the city, to play as the God of War. So it was a huge bummer when he immediately got shrink-rayed, and an even bigger disappointment when he loses all of his godly powers a little bit later. But I got over my disappointment pretty quickly, because this opening is awesome! Maybe my favorite in the whole series. This section plays out similarly to the Athens section of the previous game. Once again, you are battling through debris-filled streets and across the burning rooftops of a war-torn city in the midst of an invasion. Of course, the big difference is that last time, the player was helping defend the city from the invading monsters. This time, you are the invading monster, mercilessly slaughtering the city's human defenders. There has been a massive technological leap forward between games. It is honestly hard to believe that God of War 1 and 2 were only released 2 years apart. There is so much more detail in the city of Rhodes than there was in Athens. Rhodes is so elegant and decorated. The interiors of the buildings are filled with ornate columns and elaborate artwork and golden flourishes. Again, the interior here really reminds me a lot of the visual design of the palace in Prince of Persia: The Two Thrones. The elegance, the decoration, the slightly exotic touches. And just like in The Two Thrones, when you go outside, you are welcomed by these grand, epic vistas of a vast burning city all around you. You get both a sense of a prosperous ancient city under siege and a sense that you are only a small part of a much larger battle. Another big difference between this and Athens is how you interact with the Colossus of Rhodes. Athens had its own giant colossus stomping around in the form of Ares. But Ares was always depicted as this distant figure, only ever appearing in the background. He was really just window dressing, whereas the Colossus of Rhodes is actively hunting you down personally. It is specifically targeting Kratos. There are multiple points where you will be inside some interior chamber, and you can see the Colossus out the window, and it will begin punching the walls, trying to smash through to reach Kratos, and parts of the building will begin collapsing around you in real time. I know that, by contemporary standards, this is not that impressive, but in 2007, I promise you, this real-time destruction was really cool, and there are a bunch of mini boss fights against the Colossus as you battle through the city, similar to the mini battles against the smaller heads of the Hydra in the opening of the first game. And one thing that I always thought was really cool about these fights is that any damage you do in the earlier confrontations gets carried through the entire level. So if in one encounter Kratos manages to slash the Colossus's face, that wound remains in all of the ensuing encounters. It makes it feel like you are slowly tearing it apart piece by piece as the battle progresses. At one point, the Colossus throws Kratos through the roof of this building, and you drop down into this bathhouse. And if you break the wall here, look what I found! A couple of hot topless babes, nice! Just because he is in the middle of a fight for his life against a magical living 1,000-foot-tall pissed-off statue does not mean that Kratos doesn't have time for a little hanky-panky with a couple of hot babes. In my previous video, I discussed how that game's sexy minigame actually did have a narrative purpose. It developed Kratos' character, demonstrated his nihilism and hedonism and lack of close personal relationships. This one, on the other hand, is purely goofy and silly, and not presented in a serious way by the game at all. This will become the standard going forward. All of these sexy minigames in future entries are more of a running joke than something that is actually meant to titillate. Anyway, moving on. Towards the end of this section, Zeus calls down to Kratos from the heavens. He offers to help Kratos by sending him the Blade of Olympus, supposedly the blade Zeus himself wielded when he slew the Titans. He tells Kratos to pour his godly power into the blade in order to create a weapon powerful enough to defeat the Colossus. This is a painfully obvious scheme designed to trick Kratos into relinquishing his power, but Kratos is a bit of a dum-dum, and so he immediately falls for it. In the final battle against the Colossus, you have to stun the statue long enough to have the time to pour all of your power into the blade, which is represented by the player's health and magic bars being depleted, and then use the blade to punch a hole in the outer shell and leap inside the Colossus itself. The battle continues into the interior, and so begins what is probably the coolest platforming section in the whole series. You have to jump and leap and climb and sidle through this complex shattered mess to reach 3 different hearts whose power you absorb with the blade before escaping out the statue's open mouth just before it explodes, ending one of my favorite boss encounters in all of God of War. The whole thing is super duper cool. Kratos is feeling pretty cool too, which is why, after defeating the Colossus, he takes a moment to give an arrogant victory speech, not realizing that the statue's massive hand is about to fall right on top of him, which it does. and instantly crushes him. Having given his godly power to the blade, he realizes that he is now mortal and vulnerable to normal attacks again. As the narrator tells us, bloodied and beaten, he knew that to have any hope of survival, he must retrieve the blade of Olympus. Humiliated before his Spartan army, Kratos dragged himself up from the dirt. He stumbles forward towards the blade as the Spartan warriors watch on in disbelief at the wounded state of their divine champion. And then, it turns out that the white bird was not Athena but Zeus, and this was all a grand scheme intended to defeat Kratos, who Zeus believes has become an existential threat to Mount Olympus itself. Who could have seen this twist coming? So unexpected. A pretty pathetic battle commences, in which a heavily wounded Kratos stumbles around for a little while before being predictably struck down by Zeus. For the second time in 2 games, Kratos has been killed by a god of Olympus and cast down into the underworld. And for the second time in 2 games, he is not going to stay dead for long. This time, in a twisted and creepy vision, he is telepathically contacted by Gaia, the leader of the Titans and the goddess of all life. She entreats him to not give up, and claims that this is not the end of his story. If he can pull himself out of the underworld, she promises that she and the other Titans will help him defeat Zeus. When I finish my retrospective of God of War 3, I will do a full deconstruction of villainy on Gaia too, because I think she is actually a more interesting antagonist than Zeus. Her dialogue in this scene, and every scene, is extremely manipulative. Her methods are very similar to those of Odin in Ragnarok. But I will discuss that more in a future video. For now, her manipulations are successful. Kratos agrees to the alliance. She is the one who gives him the mission to journey to the island of creation and seek the Sisters of Fate. God of War 2 features what is by far our shortest visit to Hades in the entire Greek saga. A quick climb through some weird hand-infested caverns and Kratos is free. It is a far cry from the endless, frustrating platforming sequences of the previous game. Once he reaches the surface, Kratos discovers that all of his warriors of Sparta are dead, slain by Zeus. All except for one, this guy, who Kratos orders to return to Sparta and defend their home city. And remember this guy because he is going to show up again later. Then Gaia sends a Pegasus to carry Kratos to the island of creation. Kratos hops on board and we begin a kind of Star Fox-style scripted aerial action sequence. While flying on the back of the Pegasus, you've got to dodge magic missiles and battle these flying monsters. I remember thinking this Pegasus battle was really cool when I was a kid, but replaying it now, I don't enjoy it as much. It is one of the few parts of God of War 2 that I do not think has aged very well. It feels a bit clunky and repetitive. It is missing the speed and fluidity that makes the rest of the game's combat so good, and it goes on for a bit too long. Anyway, before reaching the island of creation, we have to make a quick stopover at the Lair of the Titan, a secluded mountain in the middle of the ocean which serves as the prison of the Titan Typhon, who traps our Pegasus under his fingers as soon as we arrive. And he orders Kratos to leave. Apparently, he did not get the memo from Gaia that we are supposed to be friends now. I have always found this to be the weakest section of the whole game. The mountain is visually very dull, especially compared to other locations in the game. It is just a bunch of featureless, identical ice caves. It lacks the visual detail and artistry of Rhodes in the island, which makes it feel boring to explore. But luckily, you do not spend a lot of time here. It is really just a short intermission between the first and second acts of the game. When you get close to Typhon, he tries to blow Kratos off these walkways, so you have to ascend very slowly and carefully before savagely ripping his freaking iris out of his eyeball to use as a magical bow. Okay, Kratos, holy crap, dude. And this is not going to be the last time in this series that Kratos cruelly abuses a trapped Titan for his own benefit. It is going to become kind of a running theme. Prometheus is also here for some reason, in the first of what is going to become a long string of random encounters with legendary figures from Greek mythology in this game. Prometheus is the titan who gifted humans with the knowledge of fire. This act of generosity infuriated Zeus, who ordered Prometheus to be imprisoned and punished in one of the most horrific ways imaginable. Just as in the traditional story, every single day an eagle slowly devours his liver while it is still inside his body, which is regenerated every single night, to then be devoured again the next day. Pretty gnarly. And this torture goes on for thousands of years. Zeus is kind of a freaking insane sadist. I always assumed the developers presented this story to the audience early in the game to demonstrate what an evil tyrant Zeus is, and to give us a reason to want to see him defeated. Prometheus requests that Kratos kill him to put him out of his misery, and in a pretty brutal scene that I do not think YouTube will let me show you without getting this video demonetized, the Spartan graciously obliges by dropping him into the fires of Olympus and burning him to death. As a reward for this divine immolation, Kratos receives the Rage of the Titans to replace his now lost Rage of the Gods ability from the previous game. In the first game, all of Kratos' magic was granted to him by the gods of Olympus, which he lost along with the rest of his power inside the Blade of Olympus. In this game, all of his magic will be granted to him by the Titans instead. Kratos does not possess any inherent magical power of his own. He is always borrowing from someone else. Moving on, after completing the Lair of the Titan, he hops back on his Pegasus and continues his journey towards the Island of Creation. This second Pegasus section is pretty similar to the first, except this one ends in a minor boss fight against this monster riding a griffin. Lots of aerial acrobatics and dodging of magical missiles, pretty cool. At the end of that fight, our Pegasus is killed, and so Kratos cinematically leaps onto the back of the griffin, tosses the monster rider off in a quick time event, and then in a move that I have always found a bit confusing, he immediately kills the griffin too. You know, the one that he is currently standing on. The only thing between him and a 1,000-foot drop into the ocean below. But whatever, Kratos, you do you, man. Not that it matters. He leaps off the back of the dying griffin, dives through the air, and then just barely manages to grab onto the side of this wall. Very irresponsible, but also super duper cool. It is moves like this one that make Kratos one of the greatest action heroes in the history of video games. And now we reach the third location of the game, the Temple of Lakhesis. Lakhesis is one of the three sisters of fate, and by far the most elegant and refined and presentable of the three, which is reflected in the design of her temple. The visual design here is inspired by typical Greco-Roman classical architecture. Lots of marble columns and friezes and sculptures and gardens, all out in the open air, and there is a sense of age here. The stonework is worn and cracked. Tangled, overgrown plants are spreading across the marble, and underneath all the elegance are hints of something much more sinister. This garden is filled with hanging corpses, most likely the bodies of those who, just like Kratos is doing now, attempted to reach the sisters and died in the process, hung up as a warning to future visitors. In the distance, you can see the Island of Time itself, surrounded on all sides by massive, sheer vertical stone cliffs, seemingly impossible to scale, as well as the dense primordial forest that covers the island's surface. And even further in the distance, what appears to be a massive mountain spire at the center of the island. I love this shot, when the player gets a view of the scale and difficulty of the adventure we are about to embark on. It is also here that we begin to learn the history of the war between the gods and the Titans, known in Greek mythology as the Titanomachy. The story is narrated by Gaia, who is explaining why she is helping Kratos and why she seeks the destruction of Olympus. She says that the Titan Kronos, former ruler of the heavens, had been given a prophecy which claimed that his reign would be destroyed by one of his offspring. In order to prevent this prophecy from coming true, he devoured all of his own children. He literally put them in his mouth and swallowed them. For some strange reason, his wife was not a fan of this child-eating behavior, and when Zeus was born, she tricked Kronos into swallowing a stone instead, allowing the boy to go free. and then Gaia, in what was supposedly an act of pure generosity and compassion, protected and cared for the child within her own body, allowing him to grow up into the ultra-powerful, tyrannical, lightning-wielding Olympian we all know and love today. Though considering her manipulative nature, she probably had ulterior motives. She claims that she was the one who nurtured his desire to free his captive brothers and sisters who were still trapped inside of Kronos' stomach. This was a big mistake, because his thirst for revenge would eventually drive Zeus to lead a war against all of the Titans, including Gaia herself, which is why she now desires to destroy the reign of the Olympians. And this is a good spot to have a discussion about God of War 2's story. Earlier in this video, I mentioned that this is the one area where I consider God of War 2 to be an inferior game to its predecessor, and now allow me to explain why. The first game's story was driven by the mystery of Kratos' past. The mystery of the man who had lost all hope, who was ready to cast himself from the peak of the highest mountain in all of Greece, who had once been a champion of the gods, but who had committed an unforgivable and unnameable sin. The game did such a good job setting up that mystery. For example, in the very first level, there is this sailor who locks himself up to protect himself, not from the rampaging monsters, but from Kratos. He says, "I know who you are, I know what you've done, and I'd rather die than be rescued by you." I found the slow reveal of his backstory piece by piece over the course of the game to be really compelling. God of War 2 attempts to do something kind of similar, but instead of slowly revealing his past, it reveals the history of the war between the Titans and the Olympians. However, it is just not as interesting. Part of the problem is that, unlike Kratos' original story, the Titanomachy is mostly just a retelling of Greek mythology. It feels a bit stiff and emotionless, it lacks the personal drama and intimacy of Kratos' story, and there is not a lot to reveal here. It all plays out in a pretty straightforward way. Another problem is the villain. Ares was a more developed character than the Sisters of Phaedar. His motivations and his relationship with the protagonist were far more compelling. I love the setting, but God of War 2's narrative has this meandering, aimless quality. Like we're just bouncing from one random encounter with some legendary figure from Greek mythology to the next, without a strong sense of thematic narrative tissue binding them together. I also find the Kratos of God of War 2 to be an especially unlikable figure. In my previous video, I discussed how he is written to be an intentionally challenging character for the audience, one who is purposefully written to be difficult to support. However, no matter how you felt about Kratos, the story made it clear that Ares was the greater evil, an insane and bloodthirsty god who needed to be stopped by any means necessary. And so Kratos' more brutal decisions, like the one to burn the Athenian soldier in the Chamber of Sacrifice, felt at least somewhat justified. But in God of War 2, Kratos has become the insane and bloodthirsty god, and it is far harder to justify his actions. For example, to complete one of the puzzles, you have to pick up this random wounded soldier and chuck him underneath this grinding millstone, crushing his body while he begs for his life. It is one of the most brutal and cruel acts Kratos commits in the entire series, and it just feels kind of evil. And it is not the only one. Later in the game, towards the center of the island, Kratos will arrive at these two auditoriums, and each one is inhabited by a worshipper of the Sisters of Fate. This is where that time loop puzzle where you have to stop the guy from jumping off the balcony occurs. Well, the reason that guy would rather die than face you is because Kratos savagely tortures them to force them into translating this ritual script. And when they finish, he crushes their skulls as a blood sacrifice to the sisters. It is pretty screwed up. A lot of times fans will say things like, "Oh, Kratos was at his worst in God of War 3, but I actually think he might be worse in this game." At least in God of War 3, through his relationship with Pandora, he begins to grow as a character again, and learns to care about someone other than himself. In this game, he just sucks. He is this miserable, hopeless asshole. It is difficult not to come to the conclusion that Zeus was probably right to try and kill Kratos. But of course, his characterization here makes total sense considering what has happened to him. I'm not calling this bad writing or anything. He is just a much harder character to support this time around, and that is by design. With all of that said, I do find the story of Kratos' rapid emotional collapse, his devolution into a true monster, to still be pretty compelling. And I particularly like the way that Gaia is shown to be manipulating all of these events from afar. How the writers make this whole thing feel like just one more chapter in the ages-long epic and cataclysmic struggle between the Titans and the Olympians. And of course, the way the story brings Greek mythology to life with such spectacle and grandeur is still awesome. So I'm not trying to claim that this story is all bad, just not as good as the first or third games in the trilogy. Anyway, back to the playthrough. The Temple of Lakhesis is directly connected to the Steeds of Time, 4 absolutely massive horse statues standing far out in the ocean. The scale of this level is crazy. These statues were a gift to the Sisters of Fate from Kronos back during his reign, meaning they have stood here since before the Titanomachy, essentially since time immemorial. These gifts were an unsuccessful attempt to earn their favor so that they would change the prophecy foretelling his doom. In Greek mythology, the Steeds of Time actually dragged the island of creation out into the ocean, away from the coast of Greece to protect it from mortals. There is a long puzzle and platforming section here that involves jumping from statue to statue and unbinding them, so that Kratos can use these whips to drive them forward, which pulls this huge chain taut, which then allows the player access to the Island of Time itself. This is also the site of the second major boss battle in the game, Theseus, a demigod, the legendary founder of the city of Athens and the slayer of the famous Minotaur. In God of War 2, he is apparently serving the Sisters of Fate for some reason. He has been named Keeper of the Steeds of Time, which basically just means that he sits around here doing nothing all day with his thumb stuck up his ass. He is a bit of a pompous jerk, and he and Kratos almost immediately begin their battle after meeting. This is a famously difficult battle on higher difficulties, one of the hardest in the entire game, though it is not so bad on lower difficulties. Theseus is a fairly straightforward smash-off. He does not have any really crazy tricks up his sleeve, he has got a magic bolt shooting spear, and he has an annoying tendency to jump up onto this rooftop out of reach and spawn some monsters in, and that is about it. The difficulty comes from his moveset and speed and the amount of damage he can do to the player rather than from some gimmick. It is a solid fight, but not as memorable as most of the ones that come later in the game. After defeating him, solving the puzzle of the colossal Steeds of Time, and crossing the chain, we finally arrive on the Island of Creation itself. We are going to spend basically the entire rest of the game on the island, and I have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to organize this section of the video. Pandora's Temple in the previous game was a lot easier to discuss because it was divided into these 4 very distinct subsections, whereas the exploration of the island is a lot more gooey. Each section flows into the next in a very fluid way. There are not a lot of clear boundaries between levels here. If I try to summarize literally everything that happens on the island, we are going to be here forever, and this video is already really long. So instead, I'm going to focus only on major events, again with a focus on story and character. Alright then, I am going to skip right past the entrance of the island, which is an area known as Destiny's Atrium, where Kratos acquires this time sphere which allows him to slow down time, though only in the presence of a statue of Lakhesis, and this is where he has his first audience with one of the Sisters of Fate, who speaks to him through this statue, which he then promptly smashes. Afterwards, Kratos steps into this forest, gazes up at the island's central spire, while some sweeping, epic music plays, and Gaia's narration explains that if Kratos can gain control of his personal thread of fate, he will be able to travel backwards in time and stop Zeus from betraying him before it ever happened. And then, out of nowhere, This horse rider charges in, takes a swing at Kratos with his hammer, misses, and then Kratos latches onto the back of his horse and gets dragged through the swamp. This is the sort of completely random encounter that I mentioned earlier that can make the game's story feel a bit unfocused. Anyway, it turns out that this horse rider is actually the barbarian king from the previous game. You know, the one who nearly killed Kratos? But then he became the first victim of the Chaos Blades when Kratos called out to Ares for help, and his entire barbarian army was destroyed. Yeah, he is back, risen from the dead, to challenge the ghost of Sparta once again. I think this is one of the coolest boss fights in the entire series, not because of the mechanics, but because of the surrounding story. This man has been on a parallel journey to Kratos's. Just like our protagonist, he refused to allow death or the underworld to be the end of his story. He too clawed his way back to the surface of the earth in pursuit of revenge. But unlike Kratos, he did not have any help from a disguised Zeus. He is not a secret demigod. He is just a mortal. He had to do it all by himself, by his own strength of will. And again, just like his most hated enemy, he has embarked on an epic and dangerous journey into the heart of the island of creation to seize control of his own fate and change the past. Except now, by complete chance, or perhaps by fate, these two old rivals will meet in battle. Two warriors who overcame death itself to be here. However, only one of them will get the opportunity to change his destiny. The barbarian king wields a mix of extreme strength and power over necromancy in battle, a bit of straightforward smashing with his gigantic hammer, alongside some magical spirit attacks. He can even summon zombies from the underworld to come to his aid, and at one point, he actually summons the boat captain from the first game, the one Kratos killed in the prologue after the battle with the Hydra, who immediately cries out, "Oh no, not you again!" It's a fun little Easter egg. I love trying to imagine the adventure this guy has been on, what he had to do to escape the underworld, what terrible monster he must have vanquished in order to acquire these necromantic powers. I like to think there is some parallel universe where the barbarian king won this fight, and then went on to destroy the Greek pantheon on his own. Unfortunately for him, nobody ever gets the best of Kratos twice, and this fight ends with him getting crushed by his own hammer. But hey, if he clawed his way out of the underworld once, maybe he can do it again. There is always a chance the barbarian king could return in a future game, which honestly, I think would be really cool. After this battle, Kratos finds himself lost in an area known as the Bog of the Forgotten, a dense, putrid, monster-infested swamp filled with rotting corpses and bubbling pools of putrescent goo. It is actually one of my favorite areas in the game. It feels very atmospheric and mysterious to me. At the center of the bog stands the half-sunken, crumbling, and trap-filled temple of Euryale, which is the location of the fourth major boss fight in the game. Unfortunately, I cannot show you this fight, because this feisty, thick swamp madam has got her humongous tatas hanging out for the entire battle, and she moves around the arena so much that there is just no way I'm going to be able to keep them behind a sensor bar. So get used to staring at a blurry screen for a while. Euryale is a Gorgon, which is a common enemy type in all of the Greek games. Gorgons are serpentine lizard women with snakes for hair and the ability to turn their opponents into stone. Think of Medusa. Euryale is by far the biggest and fattest Gorgon in the entire series, and she's got the biggest tatas too. She uses her massive girth as a weapon, flopping and spinning around the interior of the temple, as well as firing off huge waves of petrifying magic. Though luckily Kratos acquired some equipment that allows him to deflect magic back in the swamp, so that comes in handy here. This can be an annoying fight, because if she manages to petrify Kratos, then his stone body can be shattered in a single hit. It is very possible to make a single mistake, instantly get shattered, and then have to start the whole fight over again. Kind of annoying, but a solid boss fight. The fight ends with Kratos tearing off her head, which he can then use as a tool to petrify his own enemies, just like in the first game. Afterwards, the player returns to the entrance of the bog and uses his new magic deflecting technique to break this wall, which allows the player to reach a new area called the Courtyard of Atropos. Atropos is the name of the second sister of Fate. Unlike the elegant Lakhesis, Atropos has a very gothy and witchy sort of design. This ancient stone courtyard is going to serve as our hub for the next section of the game. The ultimate goal here is to disable this magical force field, which is preventing us from accessing the interior of the island. In the courtyard, it is also possible to hear a muffled voice calling for help. It seems that someone is trapped somewhere nearby. Who could it be? Well, after exploring around and solving some more puzzles, you will find out who it be. Kratos pops open this door and walks inside this pool area, and as the door closes behind him, Perseus appears, yet another demigod and legendary hero from Greek mythology. He is the slayer of Medusa and the founder of the city of Mycenae, as well as an ancestor of the more famous Hercules. Perseus is very upset that Kratos allowed the door to close behind him. He has apparently been trapped in this room for a very long time. However, if you notice in this shot of the room, there is no wall on the far end. It is just a series of open columns. As far as I can tell, Perseus could have left at any time. I've never been sure if this is a mistake or if Perseus is just completely brain dead. Either way, in his despair, Perseus goes on a long, rambling, self-important monologue in which he convinces himself that the Sisters of Fate wish for him to defeat Kratos in order to earn their favor. It is a fun cutscene because Kratos just kinda sits in the background and stares in silence, while Perseus does all the work by himself of getting himself worked up like a pompous doofus. And so begins the 5th major boss fight of the game. This is one of my favorites. I really like this one. In Greek mythology, the gods have a habit of giving their champions magical gifts, which the champions then use to defeat monsters and complete heroic deeds. Perseus is an entire boss fight designed around this concept of magical godly equipment. He exclusively wields these things in battle, and so what Kratos has to do is destroy each of these pieces of heroic equipment one by one, methodically destroying everything that makes Perseus a hero, until in the end he is just left an ordinary defenseless man. The first is a helmet that allows Perseus to turn invisible. You have to carefully watch the water to see where he moves, and then attack that location. After the helmet is destroyed, he still has a magical sword and shield, with which he fights very aggressively. Next we destroy the sword, at which point Perseus switches to a defensive fighting style using only his shield, which has the power to blind his enemies. But even that is not going to be enough to stop Kratos. The fight ends with Perseus impaled on this hook, which then lowers a chain, allowing us to return to the courtyard with his shield, which the player must use to reflect this laser beam, thus destroying the force field. Perseus is not a very difficult or flashy fight, but I find the concept of slowly wearing an opponent down, of methodically removing each of his abilities, to be very satisfying. The next major area we reach is called the Great Chasm, which is this massive canyon which separates the imposing and beautiful temple fortress home of the Sisters of Fate from the rest of the island. As Kratos steps out onto this shattered and ruined bridge, he is randomly met by yet another famous figure from Greek legend, Icarus, the boy who flew too close to the sun. In the traditional story, Icarus is a young, reckless boy who, overcome by excitement, forgets his father's warnings about flying too high, and after his wings are destroyed, he falls into the Aegean Sea and tragically drowns. In God of War 2, Icarus is a smelly and weird old man who has clearly lost his mind. This encounter is so strange and bizarre that I'm not even really sure how to describe it, so I'm just going to play it for you. Here it is.
There's no passage here. You will never make it across. You think you can, but you cannot. Do you hear me? It's my wings that will make it across. It is my test! Do you not know who I am? Have you not heard of Icarus? It is my fate to make it across! None other! This is my test! The sisters will grant me an audience, not you. You will die, White Warrior. You will die.
I will reach the Sisters of Fate, and I will use your wings to do so.
The sisters will not allow you, a fallen god, to bathe in their light!
So yeah, I don't know. Kratos and Icarus fall down into the chasm and a short mid-air boss fight commences. That ends with Kratos ripping the artificial wings out of Icarus's back so that he can fly safely into this chamber, while Icarus drops screaming down into the deepest depths of hell. That's what you get for being a weirdo, and don't forget it. Here is a fun coincidence. Metroid Prime 3 released the same year as God of War 2, and also featured a boss battle that took place entirely while falling down into an endless chasm, except that one was against a giant techno laser dragon instead of a smelly old man, so it was better. 2007, another very good year for video games. Anyway, moving on. After the encounter with Icarus, Kratos once again finds himself trapped in the underworld, this time in the prison chamber of Atlas, yet another Titan. There is a common misconception that, in Greek mythology, Atlas is said to hold up the entire Earth. In the original story though, he actually only holds up the sky. The developers of God of War 2 either didn't do their homework or, more likely, decided that the misconception is actually cooler than the original, because in this game's version of the story, Atlas is in fact, apparently, imprisoned by Zeus and forced to hold up the entire world. This is another one of my favorite areas in the game. The whole section is basically one big platforming sequence, in which Kratos has to hop around both the outside and inside of Atlas's mountain-sized body in order to reach the top. The interior of his body is really bizarre. It is a mix of stone and fire and bone and flesh, so you're jumping and flying around tendons and spinal cords and rivers of lava. There's this one puzzle where you actually have to push a piece of his spine out of place. I just love the visual design here. It is so grotesque and alien, like something out of a horror movie. When you do reach the top, Atlas, who has also apparently not been notified about their new alliance, tries to kill Kratos. At one point, he actually blames Kratos for his current circumstances, and the reason why will be revealed in the prequel game, Chains of Olympus, which did not release for a whole year after this one. Atlas is also the character who, in a very flashy CGI pre-rendered cutscene, reveals the true cataclysmic horror that was the Titanomachy, as the Titans had their very souls ripped out of their bodies by Hades, before being cast down into the deepest layer of the underworld, the abyssal eternal prison of Tartarus. In the present, Kratos manages to convince the Titan that they are actually friends, and so Atlas pops Kratos back up into the chasm entrance where he was ambushed by Icarus. At this point, we are closer to our final goal than ever before. Somewhere in this fortress, the sisters are waiting for us. After you get through the entrance, where you have to deal with a fairly irritating spinning room, spiky floor, endlessly respawning enemies puzzle, you reach this overlook, where you can see the central spire on the other side of this chasm. The player has to find some way to reach that spire. You may also notice that the spire has a bit of a feathery appearance, as if it were not composed of stone at all. How intriguing. From the overlook, the player has to travel to the two auditoriums I described before. The one where you torture the priest and crush their skulls to serve as blood sacrifices to the Sisters of Fate. This causes the wings of the spire to unfurl, revealing that it was a colossal bird all along. And this sacrifice also leads to an audience with a pre-recorded holographic version of Lakhesis. And would you look at that, she's got her goddamn tatas hanging out. Well, one tata, actually. Freaking hell, Santa Monica. How the heck am I supposed to edit this video when I cannot even fully show the main villain of the game? You horny bastards. In her second pre-recorded message, Lakhesis commands Kratos to resurrect a dead phoenix from its ashes in order to complete the final step of his journey. This leads to a series of what are by far the most difficult and most frustrating puzzle and platforming sections of the whole game, including that one I described earlier, where you have to push the block across the room against the waves of fire and the infinite respawning enemies. Very annoying. But if you manage to accomplish all of that, congratulations, you have given birth to a brand new baby phoenix, which you then have to blast with some winds of Borealis to free it from this lava spout, and then it waits patiently on the other side of the chasm to carry you into the feathery and foul lair of the Sisters of Fate. On your way over there, Kratos encounters yet another fellow champion who is seeking the sisters. In the shadows of this chamber, his face remains hidden, so we do not know who it is yet. It is a very simple and easy battle, during which the champion keeps calling out things like, "I've come too far, I can't lose now." But apparently he can lose now, because this fight ends with Kratos tossing the guy through the wall and impaling him on his swords. But look! In the light of day, it is revealed that this champion is actually that Spartan warrior from the beginning of the game, the one who Kratos commanded to return home and defend Sparta. What is he doing here? Well, this warrior, now known by the pretty slick title of the last hero of Sparta, explains that the city of Sparta has been destroyed and its entire population annihilated by Zeus as punishment for Kratos' bloody conquest across Greece. After the city's destruction, this guy took it on himself to journey to the island of creation in an attempt to change the fate of his home and family. Once again, I love this concept of parallel journeys, that Kratos is not the only hero trying to reach the Sisters of Fate, and in some ways he is not even the most impressive of them. This Spartan soldier is not a demigod. He does not have gifts given to him by the gods or magical powers bestowed upon him by the Titans. He does not have Kratos' decades of experience or superhuman strength. He is just an ordinary soldier fighting with ordinary weapons. And yet, look how far he came, how close he got to the end. Through sheer grit and determination and strength of will, he even made it further than Perseus or the Barbarian King or the smelly old Icarus. If you pay attention while exploring the island, you can actually occasionally see him in the background, fending off monsters during his own adventure. I have always thought that a spin-off where you play as this character and you experience his journey would have made for a fantastic God of War game. I have always wished the developers would have done a game based on a side story like that, instead of adding more and more prequels to Kratos' story. But whatever, let's get back to the game. Remember back at the beginning when I talked about how, having lost everything else, Kratos adopted the warriors of Sparta as his new family. They became his final connection to the rest of the world, his sole reason for living. Well, now that final connection has been severed. Once again, his family has been destroyed by the machinations of a mad god of Olympus. He has lost his last reason to keep on fighting. And so, for the second time in his life, Kratos gives up. He loses all hope. When he is attacked by this hideous, squiddy tentacle monster after the death of the last Spartan, he does not fight back. If you press a button on the controller to try and get him to defend himself, the on-screen character actually refuses to budge. Instead, in a fury, he cries out, "I am tired of the lies of the gods." He allows the Kraken to grab him in one of its giant slimy tentacles and awaits his fate. But at the last second, right as he is about to be devoured and killed, Gaia once again intervenes. She sends him a new vision and speaks to him in the form of his late wife, Lysandra, a deeply manipulative strategy. She persuades him to keep on fighting so that he can accomplish his revenge against Zeus, which is really him accomplishing her revenge against Zeus. And moreover, she gives him the actual fire that Zeus used to burn down Sparta, which causes his rage ability to dramatically grow in power. With this newfound power, he breaks free from the Kraken's grasp, and so begins the 6th major boss fight of the game. The Kraken is something of a rarity in the God of War series, as one of the few boss battles not based on Greek mythology. As far as I know, there is no Kraken in Greek myth. Funny enough, it is more of a Scandinavian legend, and so would have made more sense to appear in the later games. Either way, it is a really good boss fight. Kratos has to dodge its attacks, wait for one of its tentacles to get stuck in the architecture, and then do some platforming and quicktime events to slice the tentacle off its body. Once you've done this twice, the Kraken will grab the last Spartan's corpse and eat it, and then you just have to knock it off the side of the balcony and impale its icky, squiddy face on this bridge. Pretty gruesome. And now you are only one Phoenix ride away from the final lair of the Sisters of Fate, a building lodged inside the gut of this giant bird called the Temple of the Fates. This temple is frozen in time when you first arrive, so you have to go through a fairly elaborate puzzle involving ringing these 2 bells in order to get time moving again, so you can smash a hole in the statue's face and proceed inside. Before you reach these sisters themselves, you pass through this room, where 3 prophetic murals have been painted on the walls, each accompanied by different text. The first reads, "The all-consuming battle between the Titans and the Olympians rages on," which is of course what happens at the start of God of War 3. The second, "A lone soul surveys the wake of carnage that surrounds him," which is how God of War 3 ends. And the third and most surprising reads, "3 travelers heading to an unknown destiny." Unlike the other 2, this third prophecy has never come true in any of the games. The mural itself appears to show the biblical story of the 3 magi journeying to the location of the newborn baby Jesus. Supposedly, the original plan for the series was for Kratos to actually become one of the 3 wise men later in his life, and after the destruction of all the ancient pantheons, he would join with counterparts from the Egyptian and Norse mythologies to usher in the new Christian religion, which would be pretty crazy. I don't think this is still the plan for the future of the franchise. Anyway, after this, Kratos finally reaches the Sisters of Fate, and I am not going to discuss that confrontation in detail in this video. Instead, I am going to do a separate video all about the Sisters of Fate. I will say only one thing here. I have spent a lot of time in this video describing the confrontations with the other Greek champions as random. But what if they were not random at all? What if it was fate? What if these Sisters of Fate have been manipulating the lives of all these different people, not to ensure destiny follows its proper course, but specifically to create a new destiny of their choosing? For now, all that matters is that it is a fantastic boss fight, one of the best in the series. After Kratos defeats all 3 of the Sisters of Fate, the stupid half-naked Lakhesis, gothy I wear too much black eyeliner Atropos, and the hideous I have way too many sagging boobies Clotho, he seizes control of his personal thread of fate, and uses it to travel back into the past and ambush Zeus during his betrayal back in Rhodes. I mentioned much earlier in the video that this time travel leads to some confusing plot holes. After traveling back in time, there are now 2 Kratoses in the past. The one who just got killed by Zeus and the one from the future. The Kratos from the future proceeds to engage in a long battle against Zeus, meaning that this version of Zeus is never able to destroy either the city of Sparta or the Spartan legions, which also means that Kratos technically still has something to live for, even though he continues to behave as if he doesn't. But the really big question is, what happened to the other Kratos? The one we just saw get killed? Does he just stay dead, trapped down in the underworld? But that cannot be true, because if past Kratos never journeys to the island of creation, then future Kratos can never exist in the first place. But the past has already been changed by future Kratos' arrival, which means we must be in some kind of branching timeline scenario. But that still does not answer the question of what happens to the other Kratos. The game itself never addresses any of these problems, so there is just a huge, confusing question mark hanging over the whole story, and it is only going to get even more confusing later on. Anyway, ignoring all of that, the true final battle of the game commences as Kratos seizes control of the Blade of Olympus. This battle has basically 3 phases, though it moves fairly fluidly back and forth between those 3 phases. In the first, just like both Ares and Kratos before him, Zeus grows to super duper huge size. And the strategy here is to create blast waves by killing these other monsters, which then harm Zeus, allowing Kratos to get in close and absorb his power using the Blade of Olympus, turning Zeus's trick against him, causing him to shrink back down to a more manageable size. Oh, and by the way, once again, just like in the first game's final battle against Ares, the player is forced to use an unfamiliar weapon instead of the chain swords you were probably using for the entire rest of the game. This time around, I think the Blade of Olympus is much faster and has a better moveset, and also the fight against Zeus is not nearly as difficult as the one against Ares was, so I don't find it nearly as annoying. Still, it is a weird decision by the developers. Anyway, the second phase is a fairly straightforward smash-off, but the third phase is a little more interesting. Zeus actually takes the Blade of Olympus away from Kratos, and then the player has to use the chain swords to beat him and take the sword back. After a final tough quick-time event, Kratos prepares to impale Zeus on the Blade of Olympus, destroying the King of the Gods once and for all. However, at the final moment, Athena reappears and throws herself between Kratos and Zeus in an attempt to stop the fighting, declaring that she does not want to fight Kratos, but it is still her duty to defend Olympus. This ends with her being the one accidentally impaled on the blade, which seems to genuinely upset Kratos, while Zeus takes advantage of the distraction to escape. As she dies, Athena reveals the truth. Kratos is the son of Zeus. Zeus's decision to kill Kratos was driven by a fear of fate. Just as Zeus once overthrew his father, he fears that one day his son will overthrow him. And of course, by his actions, he has just ensured that that prophecy will come true. Athena pleads with Kratos to end his quest for vengeance, for, she says, no son should kill his own father. This plea falls on deaf ears as Kratos recommits himself to not only the death of Zeus, but of any god who dares stand in his way. If all of Olympus will deny him, then all of Olympus will fall. And believe it or not, the game is not over yet. After Zeus escapes, Kratos returns to the future, back to the Temple of Fates, and once again uses the Threads of Fate to travel back in time. Except now he goes much further into the past, all the way back to the age of the original Titanomachy, the age of the first war between the Titans and the Olympians. Once there, he meets with Gaia, who says that she has been waiting for him. Kratos tells her that the Titans are destined to lose the war in this past age, but that if they will come with him into the future and fight at his side, to a time when both Ares and Athena are already dead, and Zeus is weakened by his battle with Kratos, they will stand a far better chance of victory. And so that is exactly what they do, which of course leads to an even bigger plot hole. If the Titans were never defeated in the past, that changes literally everything. The entire course of history in this world should be transformed. Whatever the case, Kratos leads the Titans back to the present and into an invasion of Mount Olympus itself. The game ends with the Olympians shocked to find that their mortal enemies have returned. A new chapter in the apocalyptic war between Olympian and Titan has begun, and there is a final shot of Gaia climbing the mountain, while Kratos, still wielding the Blade of Olympus, rides on her back as he declares,
Zeus, your son has returned! I bring the destruction of Olympus!
This is an awesome conclusion to the game, setting up a truly epic confrontation between Kratos and all of Olympus in the third game. And this is where my very long retrospective of God of War 2 ends. God of War 2 is one of the best action-adventure video games ever developed. In a lot of ways, in terms of the scale, the spectacle, the setting, the fantastic places you explore, the boss fights, the puzzles, the platforming, I think it still outshines even the Norse games. After replaying the entire God of War series in the past few months, I think God of War 2 might still be the best game in the whole franchise. Sure, God of War 3 has better action, and there is no doubt in my mind that the story and characters of God of War 4 are miles and miles ahead. But as an overall package, as an adventure game, God of War 2 still stands shoulder to shoulder with the best in the genre, even nearly 2 decades after its release. God of War 2 was named by critics as the swan song of an entire generation of video games for good reason, because God of War 2 is still a phenomenal video game.